Our next speaker is Klais, and he will be discussing pollinator-friendly practices in a forested landscape. So take it away, Austin.
Thanks, Leslie. So we've definitely had some great talks today, and we've kind of covered some of the main landscape or land uses throughout Arkansas. So we had some talks on row crop areas, cropland, and then several good talks on grazing and pasture land. Kind of one of the last main land use that we really haven't talked about quite yet is forest land. And so forest land, I guess today in Arkansas, let's see, there we go. It's about 56% of the state, so 19 million acres, which is a pretty significant amount of land when you're taking into account wildlife habitat or anything else along those lines, pollinator management, that sort of thing. And of that 19 million acres, about 84% of that is upland forest types. So most of that's dominated by oak or pine, some hickory in there. But when you take that into account, that's roughly 45% of the entire state. So really looking at the management potential of those areas, with good forest management, you can impact a large amount of what is available throughout the state. And one of the interesting things to me, as we're looking at forest lands in Arkansas, this picture in the top right there, that's a fairly dense forest, is not uncommon at all. You can see there's a lot of pine needles and leaf litter there, and not a whole lot of other resources growing underneath. A lot of times it's shaded out. And, as a state, we're producing about 40% more growth on our timber than what gets harvested or what gets killed by any means. So a lot of times that is promoting rather dense forest stands. And we've really gotten good over the last 50, 60 years at growing timber. Actually gotten so good in some cases that we're growing timber in areas that it historically wasn't grown. So take a look at this picture. This is an area in southern Arkansas. The yellow line there actually used to be historic prairie. If you saw a couple of the talks yesterday, I think Jay mentioned that the GLO maps have a lot of historic prairies that were mapped out. These were areas that had 0 trees in them. And as you can see in this picture, that dark green is actually forest land. So about half of this particular historic prairie is now covered in planted trees. So that kind of brings to question, what did those forest lands look like historically? If we look at them now and we think, well, they're covered in forest, well, maybe that's what it always was. That's not necessarily the case. Throughout most of Arkansas, in recent history, we had really open landscapes. Not only do we have native grasses in the prairies and forbs in those prairies, but we had a lot of open forest land that would have supported the same type of understory. So, if you look back roughly 200 years ago and more, before there was a lot of more modern disturbances, the GLO surveyors that we talked about, they came through and they documented a lot of what the landscape looked like at that time. And there were also some other explorers, and what they noted more often than not are these really open forest systems, a lot more open than what we see today. So spacings of 50 to 100 feet between trees. And most of the time when we go out in the woods today, you're looking at, trees maybe 10 to 20 feet apart, much closer spacing than what we used to have historically in these mature systems. Henry Schoolcraft is an example of one of those explorers that came across the Ozarks in Arkansas and Missouri. And, one of the things that he noted, as you can see there in his quote, was that one of the greatest inconveniences that they had was trouble finding wood and water. When you walk through the woods today, you wouldn't have much trouble finding dead wood for firewood because it's everywhere. We have very dense systems. But, historically, these woodlands and savannas, this continuum of different open landscape habitats would have naturally occurred through most of the state. Most of that, those upland forest types we talked about, that 16 million acres, a lot of that would have been open, some sort of open woodland or savanna. So, Arkansas woodlands are really an interesting mix when you're looking at what species are in those habitats. You have eastern forest that's kind of your canopy cover most of the time, maybe post oaks, maybe shortleaf pine, maybe different white oak species. But you also have a lot of herbaceous species and wildlife species that are more western. So diamondbacks, prickly pear cactus, roadrunners, which is really kind of an interesting situation when we get anywhere from 40 to 60 inches of rain across most of Arkansas. And there's been a lot of research recently, I guess, going into these types of systems and kind of comparing these to the pictures that we looked at earlier, the more dense modern forests. And you can see just a tremendous increase in herbaceous plants in these systems. And that's what really characterizes them. Oh, there we go. So a lot of those systems were essentially created with fire as a management or as a driver of that landscape. As Shelley mentioned and several others, fire was a historical process that would have occurred on the landscape. And with that, you see a lot of species responding to that. So in this particular example is looking at bird species. You look at species like mourning doves and bobwhites in woodlands and savannas that are basically they're created with fire. You have that open canopy and you have that understory vegetation that allows those species that need the forbs and the native grasses, they can survive throughout the entire succession of a forest. And then in open pine habitat in particular, you would also get red-headed woodpeckers, which really need that open forest condition. And again, that kind of goes back to that fire history of the landscape creating those open forest conditions. But a lot of what we see today is more like this picture. It's really dense forest land, and there's a lot of trees on the landscape, as I mentioned earlier, and those bird species are restricted to times that maybe the landscape is a little bit more open. For example, the mourning dove and bobwhite there in the first few years before the trees really crown out and get too dense where you have full canopy closure. You'll also see that the cockaded woodpecker, red cockaded woodpecker, doesn't inhabit this type of forest land. And that's pretty much what we would expect based on what we know about their habitat needs and their food and nesting needs. So then the question becomes, well, what about pollinators? How do they respond to these different types of forest conditions? And overall, it's been mentioned a couple of times, but in general, pollinators really tend to prefer these open forest land conditions compared to closed forest land, closed canopy conditions. Again, those closed canopy conditions just don't support the understory that you need for a lot of these pollinator species. So just looking through several research papers, looking at the difference between open forest stands and closed stands, they saw increases in beetle abundance, fly abundance, butterfly and moth species diversity, butterfly abundance, and bees in particular. There was a great study that looked at the number of bees in open managed forest stands compared to closed canopy stands. They had 4 times as many species of bees in the open stands, 50% higher species of bees, and 4 times as many total abundance of bees there. You see the same thing with a lot of, less common upland pollinators like Diana fritillaries or great spangled fritillaries. There's a good study done on those in the Ouachita's that saw 5 to 20 times more of those types of butterflies in these open managed stands compared to closed canopy stands. And so the question that a lot of us are faced with is, well, how do you manage for those types of stands that promote pollinators? And there's really 3 main things I think to consider when you're talking about that type of management. What's the ecology of the site? what are the current conditions, and then what are the desired conditions, and how do we get there? So we'll kind of explore that briefly. As far as the ecology, there's several different factors to always consider. If you heard some of yesterday's panel discussion, they really hit on some of those well there. But soils, this picture is from a glade site that are fairly common in northern Arkansas, have really essentially thin soils, maybe rocky outcrops. They historically don't really support many species of trees or much density of trees, and that's true a lot of the glades today as well. That's kind of the way that they should be managed for when you're talking about ideal management from a forest landscape perspective. The slope and the aspect of that slope, so which direction is that slope facing, is going to really impact your forest management. So for example, south-facing slopes are usually hotter and drier and have fewer trees and a different set of tree species that grow on them as compared to north and east-facing slopes. So we have these great things that are called ecological site descriptions. And USDA is working on a lot of those for Arkansas right now. They're kind of undergoing development, but you can look at, if you search for ecological site descriptions online, there's some great resources out there to actually see what historically we think that site would have been. So you can kind of go through the map and get down to your area, and it'll talk about, the slope, the soils, all these different factors and how that would have impacted the ecology of that site. The understory potential is something that they really talked about yesterday in the panel discussion, and that's really important when you're talking about the forest management and what to expect out of that management. So for example, this picture on the right had a really great seed bank that was released from thinning, but there are some sites that don't necessarily have that high quality seed bank with some of those more conservative plant species that you'll hear a lot of us talking about. Things like dwarf larkspur and pale purple coneflower. That's not necessarily going to be on every site, but it is always good to know that site history. So that's kind of the ecology characteristics to consider. And again, looking at the current conditions that we're faced with across most of the landscape, you've got a dense overstory and a dense mid and understory. So you're shading out your native grasses and your wildflowers on all levels. In North Arkansas, it's usually species like red maple or hickory that are overly dense, and South Arkansas maybe sweet gums. So looking at these time-lapse pictures on the right, you can see this is actually taken from the exact same point, and over a timeline of basically 45 years there, you completely change from an open system to a closed canopy system if you don't have that continual management and coming back with prescribed fire and other forest stand improvement. So if this is our current conditions, how do we get to that open stand that we all want for promoting pollinators and other wildlife species? Usually the first step that we try to do, if possible, is do a prescribed burn. That first burn is going to get, if you can do it during the right time of year, usually we try to get that as a cooler burn, not necessarily in the middle of summer, but usually late fall into winter, trying to remove some of that fuel that's built up over the last few decades that stand has gone without fire. And that's really important for promoting long-term resiliency of that stand. By reducing those fuels, you're actually protecting a lot of the timber from a potential wildfire down the road. It's also going to leave the trees that you would probably want, so the residual trees. What's going to be left after that first fire is going to be your bigger stems, your larger trees. Your really small diameter trees a lot of times may be knocked out by that first fire, and sometimes your second and third fires as well. But that first fire will really help get the process started. So if you can start out with a fire, that's going to set you up for long-term success in the management. And once you get that first burn in, then you may be looking at, well, how can we reduce the stems that are left? what is left? Is it mostly overstory? Is it mostly mid-story? How can we do a commercial thinning, or do we need to do some sort of selective forest stand improvement using selective chemicals? And that's all going to be based on, you know, what your forest looks like after you've started burning. Ideally, we would use commercial thinning if at all possible, because then a lot of times that can be used to further manage the system. The funding from that commercial thinning can be used to further manage the system. So once you get to that point, then your burn frequency becomes really important. You know, now that we've got this stand open, you're going to get a quick vegetation response. So some general frequencies first few years of restoration is going to be burning 3 times in the first 5 years and then 5 times in the first 10 years. And that seems like a lot, but what we're really trying to do is get that vegetation community to represent, or to manage that community to have a lot of native grasses and wildflowers that we're shooting for. Sometimes you may get a really strong shrub or sapling response once you open up that canopy. So getting in there with a good burn frequency is going to be really important. And like we mentioned, that first burn is usually going to be in the fall or winter as a cooler burn. So that October through February timeline, depending on the weather and the fuel characteristics, because you're really trying to just wear some of that fuel down and knock some of those saplings back. But after that first burn, you can really adjust your burn window a little bit more to focus on what types of species you're trying to promote. So you can open up that burn window from August through February. So once you get it to that stage, after you've done your first burn, burn season really has an impact on what vegetation responds. So late growing season burns in roughly August through October generally are going to promote some forb growth. I think somebody mentioned that earlier, that season can really provide a lot better forb response. A lot of times those late growing season burns burn patchier and create a different mosaic of burned versus unburned patches immediately adjacent to each other, rather than the burns that we're used to seeing maybe in the wintertime, which is basically black across the entire area gets burned. And there's no cover left, and that's not necessarily what we're trying to shoot for either. Those late growing season burns are also really good for knocking back a lot of your sprouts and your saplings that are coming back in. Whereas your dormant season burn, roughly November through February, is more of a quote maintenance burn, if you will. It's basically just taking off the fuel and the litter. And a lot of times that may end up actually giving us a stronger shrub and sapling layer than what we want. So we don't want to stick to just a dormant season burn all the time. Then comparing that to an early growing season burn, which is going to be your March through July timeframe, that's usually going to promote your grasses, but that's also hitting your forbs as soon as they green up in the spring, and it really knocks them back, and it's pretty tough on your forbs. So trying to avoid that as much as possible and really focus on that August through October or November to February timeframe. So we've got a few comparisons to make, because you get the question quite a bit of, well, how does that look on the ground? And a lot of times we look at the benefits of maybe burning alone or of maybe thinning alone. And the question becomes, well, which one do we really need? Do we need both? So we looked at that actually in comparing. This is a landowner that was wanting to manage for open forest land for quail and for pollinators. And he had some stands that were thinned and some that were not thinned at the time. So this was actually in March, coming out of winter. So you have the thinned and the not thinned there. And then this is right after the burn, so a week after the burn. You can see burn coverage was pretty good in both sites. looking at that picture on the left, you can see there's a lot more sunlight on the ground as compared to the picture on the right. There's still a pretty good canopy there on the right. There's also a lot of sweet gum in that stand, a lot of sweet gum saplings in that stand. So not only was the light being infiltrated by the pines over the top, but also by the sweet gum underneath it. And you can see the differences here. This is just one growing season. If I remember right, these pictures were probably in August after that burn was completed, and it was just thinned the year before. So you can see on the left, there's a lot of flowers that are a little bit hard to pick out from this picture, but a lot of the white flowers there, a lot of asters, a lot of bone sets, those types of things were coming back into this stand. Whereas the one on the right that hadn't received the thinning still had a lot of sweet gums coming back. And there were some sweet gums on the left, but not near as many as the one on the right that light was still being intercepted, so those forbs and grasses couldn't respond near as well in that picture on the right. So on that same property, this was actually the year after in a different stand that was also thinned and burned. You got a really good response from a lot of annuals and biennials. So this property in particular had an interesting history. It was cropland until the 80s. And as mentioned during the panel discussion yesterday, there's a lot of impacts on that herbaceous plant community up through that cropland period. A lot of chemical use, a lot of heavy disturbance. So a lot of the species that you see coming back on this site are tickseed sunflower, camphor weed, a lot of annuals, biennials, maybe short-lived perennials that really tend to colonize a lot of these habitats very quickly. But they're not necessarily the types of species that you would expect from a high-quality, undisturbed type of site. Many of these species are pretty common on the landscape even in disturbed areas, which they're still great for pollinators, they're still great for wildlife, but that just goes back to knowing your site history and knowing what to expect out of that herbaceous layer is going to kind of guide what you think you'll be able to do with that property and the management of that property. But a good thing even about this type of habitat is there's been some research done on similar stands of thinning and burning with the same type of habitat response in regards to monarch butterflies. And they found there are roughly 100 times more nectar resources during fall migration in stands just like this as compared to unmanaged or unburned and unthinned stands. So again, those pollinator resources are really, you get quite a bit of benefit out of managing even stands like this. And again, here's another picture a little bit closer up. You can see some of the different species in there, some camphor weed, some goat weed, so just different species that you would expect in those types of forest stands. So you take this type of forest management stand and compare it to a stand that maybe is on those historically undisturbed soils with a good seed bank. And this is what you may expect in those type of woodlands and savannas. You get species that are really high conservation values, so pale purple coneflowers, purple poppy mallow, coreopsis, I mean, just all sorts of things on this particular site that came back just from thinning and burning. Those were the two main practices on here. But again, this site was historically a woodland. And really all that had happened to this site was that the trees had started to just become too dense. So for the management of it, all that we had to do was remove or lower the density of trees, put prescribed burning back in it, and this is the type of vegetation response in there. So you can get excellent pollinator benefits out of different types of stands. But again, that just kind of puts it in a frame of reference on what you can expect from different types of stands. So with that, I think we can go ahead and take some questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Austin. We do have a couple questions that have come in, and just a reminder for those that have just joined us, feel free to enter your questions into the chat box, and if you're viewing on Facebook Live, into the comments section. So our first one is, they're just curious about what can be done to effectively deal with sweet gums.
To effectively deal with sweet gum, prescribed fire is going to be your best friend. And getting in there and having good fires, good fire frequencies, and also changing up the season of fire is going to make a big difference on sweet gums. There's been some great research in the past looking at those growing season fire effects, particularly in the coastal plain. But over a period of years, by using those growing season fires, they were really able to knock those sweet gums out a lot better than using dormant season fires. If that alone doesn't do it, there may be some selective herbicide options to look at.
Great answer, Austin. Another question is, what would be your recommendations on a property planted in trees because the area frequently floods? Would you thin the stand as much as an upland area?
So even those, if they're more bottomland stands, historically those types of stands also would have been a lot more, they wouldn't have been closed canopy all the time. So they would have gone through periodic disturbances, and sometimes that would have been fires, sometimes it could have been storm events that knocked trees down. I mean, there's all sorts of natural historic disturbances that would have occurred to open up those stands and create an herbaceous component to that stand as well. So as far as thinning it to the same density, not necessarily, but there is still room for some sort of disturbance in those types of systems.
Awesome. Let's see. So where can I find a list of recommended companies who will thin a timber stand and do it in a very sustainable way?
So there should be some lists through the Department of Forestry, Arkansas, Department of Agriculture Forestry Division. They have some vendor lists. You can also check with your local biologist or local forester that you're already working with. They may be able to point you in the right direction. So
for landowners managing for timber but wanting to balance wildlife, is shortleaf pine a good alternative to loblolly pine for planting?
Absolutely. And even at that, we always want to look at the site itself. You want to see, what historically would have actually grown on that site. If it's a site that would have historically supported shortleaf, then that is absolutely a good option. Another great thing, a big difference between shortleaf and loblolly is that shortleaf is more fire resistant and can actually root sprout. So even if it does get killed in a prescribed burn when it's young, it can root sprout and regrow after that.
Great presentation. Austin, said Leslie in Oklahoma. Do your burn frequency recommendations, 3 times in the first 5 years and 5 times in the first 10 years, apply equally to forests dominated by pines and hardwoods, like cross timbers? I think that's probably a good general rule of thumb, or a good frequency to shoot for. I don't know specifically about the cross timbers, but I would expect it to be very similar because you're looking at a lot of post oak type woodlands. So I think you're going to be shooting for the same types of frequencies to really wear through that shrub and sapling response that may not be exactly the vegetation that you want in that restoration phase. Great, Austin. Lots of people complimenting you for and thanking you for sharing your expertise and knowledge. Someone did mention that the Nature Conservancy in Arkansas is beginning to use summer burns for managing sweet gum and getting good results, but I think we're out of time. So thank you so much, Austin, again for presenting.